I'm Josh Christensen.
I'm Kristin Toussaint.
And this is Most Innovative Companies. On today's episode, Fast Company global tech editor Harry McCracken.
They went from almost not being a company at all to being a company that was able to ship one of the most ambitious computers of its time in very quick order.
Inequality Media co-founder Robert Reich and executive director of Inequality Media, Heather Kinlaw Lofthouse.
The strongest force in American politics is anti-establishment anger.
And as always, keeping tabs.
Can you imagine if the first thing you ever saw about Kalshi was we don't do death markets?
But first, here's the download. The news you need to know this week in the world of business and innovation. President Trump addressed the nation, or at least those watching cable, in a primetime address last night. He said the offensive against Iran will continue for another 2 to 3 weeks and reiterated a threat to bomb their power grid should a deal not be reached. He also implored allies to get involved and secure the Strait of Hormuz for themselves. Markets did not react well to the news. The Dow opened down more than 1%, the Nasdaq fell close to 2%, and the price of U.S. oil surged 12% to over $113 a barrel.
There's been another round of layoffs in the tech industry. Oracle began laying off thousands of employees earlier this week, according to reports by CNBC and Business Insider. Employees said they received emails on Tuesday morning announcing the cuts. Those emails, per Business Insider, began by saying, quote, "After careful consideration of Oracle's current business needs, we have made the decision to eliminate your role as part of a broader organizational change. As a result, today is your last working day," end quote. The reason for these layoffs isn't clear, but Oracle has been under pressure to cut costs as it pours billions of dollars into AI. Tech companies across the board have been firing thousands of employees in recent years, but layoffs have seemed to ramp up lately, with AI often cited as the reason. Amazon, Pinterest, Epic Games, and Meta have all cut staff this year.
Probably not directly, but I wonder if the Warner Brothers Discovery merger has anything to do with this.
That's an interesting question. There's a lot of things obviously happening at once, so it's like who knows the direct thing, but that's interesting.
It might be just like a tiny bit of a roll since Larry Ellison did guarantee out of his Oracle stock a large chunk of that deal. Should that deal go through, it still faces regulatory hurdles. Let's transition to something a little lighter, and I've got lots of puns in this next news item. So we've got a spicy merger and acquisition happening in the food sector this week. Spice maker McCormick, see what I did there, is acquiring Unilever's food business. It's Unilever, but I always want to say Unilever. But it's not, it's Unilever. Well, anyways, McCormick is acquiring Unilever's food business in a $44.8 billion deal. The deal is the largest in both companies' history. Unilever now will focus on its beauty, home, and personal care business. Investors, however, found the deal to be bland, maybe lacking flavor, and share prices fell for both companies following the announcement.
Great puns. Great job. Back to AI news. Sora is dead. Last week, OpenAI shut down the AI video generation tool just a few months after its launch last fall. Sora had a splashy debut, but then its popularity saw a steep decline, which meant OpenAI was losing a lot of money on these videos. AI video generation requires large amounts of computing resources, so killing Sora does free up resources as OpenAI continues to try to win this AI race that all these tech companies are undertaking. Sora's shutdown was a bit abrupt. Just this past December, OpenAI had signed a $1 billion deal with Disney to use its characters in Sora videos. That deal is now canceled.
Didn't they also pause indefinitely, like the AI, like spicy mode or
yes,
adult
they
mode
did, yeah.
too?
All those sort of side quests that they kept talking about, which seems to be that they're refocusing, I guess.
Well, I think Claude Code really kind of took everyone by surprise, and it seems like coding is the main area. AI is the two main areas, which this was bound to happen anyways. It was going to narrow at some point, and it seems like this is where it is. Finally, in case you missed it, there was a massive heist. This is my favorite story. There was a massive heist in Europe last week, a Kit Kat heist. Apparently, a truck carrying Formula One-themed Kit Kats from Italy to Poland got intercepted, and about 12 tons of chocolate bars were stolen. The news went viral, becoming something of a meme, because of course it would. Even the company took advantage of the loss to ramp up its PR. In a statement, the company said, quote, "We've always encouraged people to have a break with Kit Kat, but it seems thieves have taken the message too literally and made a break with more than 12 metric tons of chocolate."
Someone was very excited to write that copy.
Oh my God. There was some Zoomer PR person like, guys,
I'm ready.
This is my moment.
But how did they take it? No one noticed them? Where did it go?
This is honestly the next reboot of Ocean's 11 needs to be about this heist.
I would watch that.
I think this is as captivating of a heist as the Louvre heist last year.
Jewels, chocolate, same thing.
It was great. Yeah, remember like the handsome guys who tried to steal the Mona Lisa or something like that? And then there was like a detective that was like, it all seemed very like Hercule Poirot. Mm-hmm. Anyways, what would be the title of this a la Murder on the Orient Express? I'll think about it. We'll find something. And that's the news you need to know today. So, Kristin, if you could plan and execute a heist on any chocolate or candy company, who would it be?
Oh,
Hypothetically.
I mean, I hate to do this to them, but Tony's Chocolonely. Those bars are so good, but they're a little bit of a splurge. So if I could heist some of those away, I think I would.
Oh my God, the Tony Chocolonely little like fun size candies that were all over the place at our innovation festival. Mm-hmm. Oh my God. I love it. Our producer, Miriam, hasn't experienced this quite yet. The Tony Chocolonely sponsorship activation.
Yeah, this wasn't just because they've been at Fast Company events. I really do love them.
No, it is very good. They are not currently a sponsor of this podcast, but we will take that chocolate money and chocolate and some chocolate as well. And we won't plan a heist to steal 12 metric tons of your chocolate. I can't stop thinking about the Kit Kat heist. I'm trying to think of what I would steal.
Yeah, what would you do?
Oh my God. Butterfingers just for the meme of it all.
Ooh.
I do love a Butterfinger. I don't think I could have 12 metric tons of Butterfinger. It's like a nice little, it gets stuck in your teeth. It's an indulgence. I feel like it has to be Reese's though. That's like a hot, like classic, could eat a Reese's peanut butter cup forever. And they just reverted to their old formula.
To the old formula, yeah. So now it's the real chocolate again.
Yeah, as it should be. Thank you for listening to our demands. We will hold off the heist for now, Reese's. So that has nothing to do with anything we're talking about for the rest of the episode. Today, we're talking about Apple. Yesterday, the tech giant that you all know and love, or maybe hate, I don't know your deal. I'm not going to yuck your yum. Well, they turned 50 years old, which every time I see a company from like the 70s be like, it's our 50th year anniversary, I'm like, that was 30 years ago. What are you talking about 50? But it is. Apple turned 50. So there's no need to really introduce Apple. It's way too ubiquitous. But there are still aspects of this company's origin story that haven't really been covered as much. And our global tech editor, Harry McCracken, set out to find and uncover some of those stories. He spoke with the co-founders, former and current employees, admirers of the products, reporters, former employers of Steve Jobs and Wozniak, skeptics of the company in its early days to get a picture of how a group of teen geeks came together in the 1970s around a love of technology and tinkering. He published a great oral history piece on our website and then joined Kristin and I to talk all about, as the nerds on the internet would say, the lore. Hey, Harry, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Josh, it's great to be here.
We are going to try to get through a decent chunk of the history of Apple. We are now at 50 years. You heard the intro. Harry's oral history on the site is how many words long, Harry? Because all I know is 70 minutes in terms if you just want to listen to the article. How many words did it come out to?
It's 11,000.
11,000.
It's 11,000 words long. As far as I know, that's the longest thing I have ever done for Fast Company by quite a bit, although it does not include all that many of my own words because it's the people who were there telling the story. So it's almost all sound bites.
We're going to get into the history. You focused really quite a bit on the early years in those 1970 through early 80s. So we'll go back in time and we'll have lots of earth tones and 70s plaid.
Pet rocks, the whole deal.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask you both this question. What was the first Apple product you personally remember using, or maybe that like came into your primary focus? Harry, I'll start with you.
Well, I do remember the context in which I was first aware of Apple, and it wasn't because I used one. When I was in junior high, my father brought home the Radio Shack TRS-80 microcomputer, which was one of the first home computers, and it had this major arch rival called the Apple II. And I was kind of a hardcore TRS-80 partisan, so I looked at the Apple II as the enemy, although I was secretly kind of jealous of it because it did really nice color graphics and was much better for games than the TRS-80.
I was hoping you were going to be like, oh, I was at Cupertino Junior High with Watt.
I'm a bit younger than those guys, although I did talk to one person, Chris Espinosa, who still works at Apple. And he's not all that old because he started at Apple when he was like 14.
Oh my gosh.
God.
Yeah.
Kristin, what about you? What was the first Apple product that you came across?
I really specifically remember having one of the old iPod shuffles with the click wheel.
Yeah.
And I also remember that because when I got it, I must have gotten it for Christmas. And I remember my dad telling me, you know, they're working on one where the entire thing is a screen. And I was like, yeah, right. Like, how would that work? And then, of course, the
How
iPod
would you
Touch.
touch a screen?
And then the iPod Touch came out like the next year. And I was like, how did you know this?
iPod was also my first introduction to Apple. Like I had very much was like a PC family. You know, growing up, I think our first computer, I can't remember, but it was definitely like a Dell computer, like a 1993 family computer, living room, always PCs until we got iPods. I remember getting an iPod when it was like not the first generation because that was like 2001, but it was definitely
the first generation had the buttons too, right? Didn't it
big,
have
thick button and a wheel, stuff like that. I think probably the first one I got was a shuffle, but I do remember the iPod first generation and being aware of that, particularly my older siblings being like, oh God, yeah, we want this. I don't want to listen to a Discman anymore. You can fit like, I forget how many songs. Like you can fit 100 songs on this thing.
The first iPod only worked with the Mac, so people who used Windows PCs weren't really paying attention. And after a couple of years, they brought it out for Windows, which was a big deal because all of a sudden Apple, which the majority of the world didn't care that much about, had a cool Apple product that worked with their Windows computers. So if Apple had not done that, it might have taken a lot longer for Apple to rebound from its difficult times and become what it did become.
Yeah. I will say a quick honorable mention to the Mac versus PC commercials that definitely like
seared in my brain.
In my brain. 2006, I think, was the first one when that came out. And yeah, I think that was one of the probably best ad campaigns in history, like period, in terms of like its actual impact in the cultural zeitgeist. But that's all our personal stories with Apple. Harry, this oral history is exhaustive, as we mentioned, covers just large swaths of this history and so many interesting, fun, less covered tidbits about the company and its founding. What surprised you most in putting together this oral history?
I think what was the most interesting was talking to these people and figuring out the exact timeline. I realized how much happened in really just a little over a year when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and their friend Ron Wayne started Apple in April of 1976. Jobs and Wozniak were like extremely young. They had no business experience. They had no money. They had long hair. They didn't always wear shoes. And a little over a year later, in August of 1977, they shipped the Apple II computer, which was really slick and became really popular. And so they went from almost not being a company at all to being a company that was able to ship one of the most ambitious computers of its time in very quick order.
I think that really comes across in the piece because I remember getting further into it and it says their ages again. And I'm like, wait, they're still 21 and 25? Like so much happened. And they're still these super young guys.
Yeah, even by the standards of Silicon Valley, where a lot of important companies have been started by young people without a lot of experience. They were on the low end on both fronts.
Can you talk a little bit about, this is sort of a behind the scenes question, but just like I think the access and who you got to talk and what you got them to talk about is just really fascinating. Beyond, obviously, you have, Woz and some of the Wayne and the big players there. But you also got some people that I don't think a lot of people would go and get to talk to you, like for a magazine for this 50th anniversary. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, oral histories are fun because you have to let the quotes do the talking, and you can't butt in that much yourself. And it's fun to have surprises. Anybody reading an oral history of Apple's early years would assume that Steve Wozniak would be part of it, and it wouldn't be much of an oral history if he wasn't part of it. But I talked to a whole bunch of people who were early employees. I mentioned the Radio Shack TRS-80. I talked to the guy who was the Steve Wozniak at the TRS-80 to give kind of the competitive perspective. Some of these people I already knew or at least had met and were easy to get to say yes. Others I had to track down. Normally, when you write about technology, you are not talking to people in their 70s and 80s and sometimes 90s. You're talking to people who work at companies and have armies of PR people to help facilitate this stuff. And in this case, I was not talking to PR people, and I was talking to folks about stuff that had happened decades earlier. And even though it was 50 years ago, I was impressed by the fact that so many people are still around, still have great memories, and we're still excited to be part of telling this story.
Yeah, I remember when I was producing season 1 of Computer Freaks for our sister publication, Inc., we were focusing on 60s, 70s founding of the internet and focusing on the ARPANET specifically. And I think the average age of people that we talked to was about 127. But some of the best interviews that you'll possibly get in your life, talking to people who were there at the founding of this nascent technology, because it really is kind of seminal moments in any of our, recent memories. We'll see what happens with AI. This may trump personal computer and the growth of the internet. That still remains to be seen. But it's really fascinating, and it's just some of the best interviews you'll get, as we see in this oral history. So obviously we mentioned Wozniak and Jobs. Wozniak extensively talks in this oral history. It seems like Jobs and Wozniak's sort of first business endeavors had to do with these things called little blue boxes. So for people who might not be familiar, tell us what little blue boxes were.
Well, this was a whole different world. In the early 1970s, if you were making phone calls, you were making them from a landline, and you were making them from a landline owned by AT&T, which was the only phone company in the U.S. at the time, and wouldn't even sell you a phone. You rented your phone from them. And long-distance calls were really expensive. They were something you only did once in a while, and you got off the phone quickly. But it turned out that AT&T had this system they used where their technicians could generate tones and send them over the phone line to do diagnostics and stuff. And some very clever hackers figured out these tones and also figured out how to make phone calls for free. And there was an article in Esquire magazine in 1971 written by a guy named Ron Rosenbaum, who I got to contribute to the story, where he talked about this shadowy world full of these mysterious figures with names like Captain Crunch, who had built these little blue boxes to generate the tones. And Steve Wozniak was at his parents' house and picked up Esquire and read this article. And it was so amazing. At first, he thought it was fiction. And he called his friend Steve Jobs to talk about it. And they realized it wasn't fiction, it was true. And because Steve Wozniak in particular was this self-taught engineering genius, he built a blue box which could make phone calls for free. And Steve Jobs, who already kind of had a feel for being an entrepreneur and was always interested in things that might make money, realized they could sell blue boxes to college students. So Jobs and Wozniak's very first business together was selling blue boxes. They did not sell all that many of them, but from then on, whenever Steve Wozniak engineered something amazing, Steve Jobs would immediately start thinking about how they could turn it into money. And within like 2 or 3 years, that led to Apple.
How did these guys get to afford the parts for computers like this, or the pieces? Because this obviously wasn't like, there was Radio Shack, you could go and you could get some things, but largely there wasn't electronic stores the way we think of today. Like, this couldn't have been easy to source or afford to purchase.
Well, it turns out it was surprisingly easy for a number of reasons. First of all, both of these guys were very lucky to have been born when they were born in Silicon Valley, because they lived in this world that was already full of tech companies. And both of Steve Jobs' parents worked for tech companies, and Steve Wozniak's father was an engineer for Lockheed. And kind of all the people on the streets where they grew up worked for tech companies, and they would mentor their own kids, as Steve Wozniak's father did, but they would also mentor neighbor kids. And if you went to these tech companies, they had all these parts that were defective for one reason or another. Sometimes it was just that the code printed on top was smudged. And if you were a teenager interested in electronics, you could go to these companies and knock on the door and ask if they happened to have any parts they didn't need. And they would go over to an enormous bin of parts and give you a handful of parts for your project.
That's so
And
fun.
a little bit later, before Apple was fully up and running, Steve Wozniak worked for HP designing calculators. And HP really liked to encourage its engineers to be dedicated to being brilliant engineers. So as Apple was getting going, HP provided some of the parts for the early Apple computers to Steve Wozniak for free. And they also let him work on these computers he was building at their office. So some of the earliest work was done at HP. And Steve Wozniak, being conscientious, then went to HP and asked them if they would like to build this computer he had designed. And they decided that that wasn't really going to be a business, so they turned it down. But despite that, HP did play a role in Apple being Apple, because Jobs and Wozniak had almost no money and couldn't have afforded to buy all the parts on their own.
You have this line in the piece about how it was both pluck and luck that led to this. And I think that really exemplifies that. Just like these things were accessible, but they also had to sort of go after them and do more than other people were doing. And another sort of example of that seems to be this homebrew computer club, right? That was sort of coming up at the time that Wozniak was a prominent member of. So tell us a little bit about that and sort of how he demoed his Apple creations there.
Yes. In the January 1975 issue of this magazine called Popular Electronics, there was this cover story on this new home computer called the MITS Altair, which cost $400. And for that, you didn't get a computer. You got the parts to assemble it and solder it yourself. But it was the first time that there was a computer that was more or less in reach of all these electronics hobbyists who were in love with the idea of owning their computer. So this was a huge deal, and it very quickly inspired this club in Silicon Valley called the Homebrew Computer Club, which met twice a month and was attended by all of these people who wanted to build their own computers. And a friend of Steve Wozniak's saw a poster for it and told Woz about it. And Woz had been working on this thing that was not quite a computer. It was a terminal that would let him connect to the ARPANET, which was the prehistoric version of the internet. And he took his terminal, he went to the Homebrew Club, and he learned that everybody was obsessed by the Altair and that his terminal was not actually all that impressive. So he started to work on a computer too. And he would go to every meeting, and he would bring his computer as a work in progress and his soldering iron and his parts. And if you were lucky enough to attend the Homebrew Club meetings in 1975 and early 1976, you kind of got to see the Apple I come into existence little by little. And a bunch of other companies, who most of which are not all that well remembered, also had people who went to these meetings and were also inspired to build computers. So kind of the whole Silicon Valley early microcomputer industry sprung from people who had gotten excited about it by attending Homebrew.
Let's talk a little bit about the funding piece of this, because, I mean, Sand Hill Road existed. There was certainly, funding and investments in business, but the venture capital sort of infrastructure that funds, innovations in the tech sector today really didn't look anything like it looks today. So you can talk a little bit about, one, the environment that they were trying to fund their business in at that time to begin with, and then how they went about and what sort of drove the capital to scale Apple, at least in those early years.
Well, there's this famous moment not too long after the Apple I was ready to go where this guy named Paul Terrell, who owned a computer store called The Byte Shop, attended a homebrew computer club meeting and was impressed by the Apple I and told Steve Jobs that he was interested in buying 50 Apple I's. The Apple I, up until that time, had just been a kit for people who were able to assemble their own chips. But Paul Terrell wanted an assembled computer, although not an assembled computer in the way we would think of it, because you still had to supply your own case and figure out how to connect it to a TV or monitor. But he placed this order for 50 computers for $500 a piece. And so he said when they came back with the 50 computers, he would pay them $25,000. And so then Jobs and Wozniak went off to the component companies, and they were able to convince the component companies to hand over the chips because Paul Terrell was going to pay them $25,000 in 30 days. And they could then turn that money over to the chip companies. So that was kind of their initial capital, just the fact that they knew they had a $25,000 order for computers. And not too long after that, they started to try to pitch investors. And at first, they had very little luck. Sequoia, which is still a very important company today, took a look at it and did not see a business there. Nolan Bushnell, who was the founder of Atari and Steve Jobs' former boss, could have had 1/3 of Apple for $50,000. He thought that Steve Jobs would never be a successful CEO, so he turned that down. But they did start to make connections from these conversations. And one of them was with this guy named Mike Markkula, who had worked at Intel and was so successful that he had retired at the age of 33. And he came out to the garage where Apple was operating at that time. And he was kind of a computer hobbyist. He loved the idea of having his own computer. He was not just looking for business opportunities, and he had some money to invest. And he's the first person who actually invested money in Apple. He helped them turn it from this small partnership into a corporation. They moved out of the garage into an actual office. He helped them get a line of credit. He put in some of his own money, and that was what they needed to build the Apple II, which was a much more ambitious computer with a beautiful case, and it was going to be mass-produced and could never have been assembled in a garage. And that was what really got them going. And because Mike Markkula was there and had a lot of credibility, a little bit after that, then Sequoia and some other investors came in and started to put money into Apple. But they probably never would have done it if it had just been these two guys in a garage.
Something that I really enjoyed in the piece is how you sort of laid out what this market was at the time, that you have these, like you said, these computer hobbyists, but then like with the store and everything, trying to get this product to people who maybe weren't hobbyists, right? And sort of having to teach them what they would want to use a personal computer for. Tell me a little bit about those sort of two distinct markets that Apple was like trying to figure out. And yeah, I loved seeing those ads too, because it's like, yeah, what would you do with a personal computer at this time?
At the time, there was a big question. In 1977, which is the year the Apple II came out, was a big year because the Apple II was much closer to being a ready-to-go computer that almost anybody could figure out. And it competed with the TRS-80, which I mentioned, and another machine called the Commodore PET. And these three machines were way more accessible than these earlier boxes where you had to buy the parts and solder them together. But even then, it was not entirely clear why you would want a computer other than to write programs in the basic programming language and play games. And it wasn't until 1979 that this guy named Dan Bricklin, who was attending Harvard Business School, came up with this piece of software, which he called a spreadsheet. Yes, it's hard to imagine now, but in the early days of computers, there was no such thing as a spreadsheet. He came up with the idea of rows and columns that would automatically update themselves as you changed any number. And that was just magical for people like accountants who up until then worked with pencil and paper. And even if they had a calculator, there was just a lot of math done manually. And Dan Bricklin and his collaborator, Bob Frankston, who helped him program VisiCalc, which was the name of their spreadsheet. They wanted to be out on all the major computers, but they couldn't tackle all of them at once. And VisiCalc kind of really needed a floppy disk drive, which not all computers had at first. In the earliest days, you saved your programs to cassette tape, which was very slow and unreliable. But Apple was quick out of the gate with a floppy drive. And so when they were deciding which computer to write VisiCalc for first, they chose the Apple II. And that very quickly was something that a lot of business people saw as something that would be worth spending $1,300 for, which was the price of the Apple II. And because it was exclusive on the Apple II at first, it really gave them a leg up. And I talked to Dan Brickla, and he said a lot of people actually really were buying their Apple II to play Space Invaders. And VisiCalc was a nice, convenient excuse because it was super useful and sounded like it might be worth $1,300 and probably would allow people to write it off on their taxes. If VisiCalc had come out on the TRS-80 instead, it's not super clear that the Apple II would have had enough traction to continue improving and selling and reach the early 80s as it did.
I think the story of technology has really been driven, like if you look at browser wars, if you look at the early protocol wars, and certainly if you look at personal computers, has been driven not even necessarily by what's the best technology, but what is the most accessible and scalable. And Jobs really had such a great mind for that, as has been storied for a long time. And there were some early indicators of that, particularly when it came to like graphics and packaging in a single unit. Could you talk a little bit about that and sort of those early signs of what we all came to know Jobs for, which was accessible product design?
Yes, well, Steve Wozniak definitely wanted other people to enjoy the computer he designed. But in the very, very early days, he would have been just as happy if all he did was hand out schematics to other hobbyists who could build their own based on his instructions. And then after they founded Apple, at first the idea was they would just sell the circuit boards and you still have to put in your parts. But Steve Jobs did really have kind of the vision to see that this might be much bigger. And in order to be bigger, it had to come truly fully assembled. Coming in a beautiful case was great. Both Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs understood that graphics were really important and that a computer that could do color was much more appealing than one that could only do black and white, which was true of the Apple I and most other computers at the time. And I mean, at first, scale was not much. When they started building the Apple II, they were building 13 of them a week, which was not much, but that was a much faster production rate than the Apple I had ever had. But within a few years, they were selling hundreds of thousands of Apple IIs, and the Apple II line stayed on the market for more than 20 years, amazingly enough.
Wow.
So eventually there were millions and millions of Apple IIs out there, and it was a popular business machine. And even after most of the world had moved on to Windows and the Macintosh, schools were still using the Apple II because schools could not afford to buy the latest and greatest. So the scale totally happened, and it was kind of a combination of Steve Wozniak wanting to build a computer that was other people would love, and Steve Jobs having the vision to see it as being something that could be a dramatically larger business than it was in 1975 and 1976.
Markula, who was one of the first investors, we talked about him. He wrote this one-pager about Apple's marketing philosophy, which had 3 points. One was empathy for the customer. The second was ruthless focus, which was do fewer things better. And the third was input value. 50 years later, do we still see these values relevant in Apple's products today?
Yeah, my story kind of ends by addressing that. And you could make a very, very long list over the last 50 years of ways in which Apple has failed to live up to those ambitions. That's not hard at all. But I think you can also see that when Apple has been Apple at its best, it's usually been because it's been good at doing those things. And you can still see those principles that he formulated 50 years ago in the company today, such as the fact that Apple, compared to most tech giants, is not trying to do anything and everything. It still has a relatively small product line. It still cares not just about the product, but also everything surrounding the product. So Apple kind of came up with the idea that the packaging of a computer product should also be nice to use, and you should not need to find a pair of scissors and cut your way through plastic to open a package. And at their best, they certainly show empathy for the customer, and they still have a more serious emphasis on privacy than most tech companies, which I think is a sign of thinking customer first. So no, they have not managed to always been true to those values. but I think they do still care. And when the company is at its best and probably at its most financially successful at too, you can see those 1970 values are still in there.
This might be apocryphal, but as someone who worked in the marketing team in the 2000s with Jobs told me once about the packaging, that they designed it. You know, when you open up a box, it's sort of like the air releases and it sort of slowly like lowers
it's very tactile,
down. It's
yeah.
very tactile. And they said, like, well, someone asked them, like, why didn't you just design it so that you just take the box off like a normal box? Why is it so slow to let it slide out? And they were like, well, it's a Mac. It takes time because it's worth it. Which might be apocryphal, attributed to Jobs, basically, like doing that job. But it makes sense in my head.
I'm quite sure that Steve Jobs did fuss over the packaging in the way you would not expect a CEO to fuss over packaging. And Tim Cook probably does not personally fuss over the packaging in the ways that Steve Jobs did.
I think last question, since we have you here and talking about sort of recent Apple products, have you gotten your hands on the new Neo at all, the new low price point Mac?
I reviewed the Neo. You can find that story on Fast Company as well as the oral history.
What's your thoughts?
It's pretty cool, I have to say. For the longest time, people thought that Apple needed to come out with a cheaper Mac, and it never did. It never got much below $1,000. And the Neo is $600. So it's way under $1,000. And there are lots of things it doesn't have in order to hit that price point. But Apple did a great job in kind of taking out things that a lot of people would not care about that much anyhow, and building a computer that still feels very nice for the $600 price point. And if you look at Windows machines that cost about the same, they're kind of plasticky and not all that impressive. And the Neo might not blow them away on things like benchmarks. And it certainly is not as fast as a MacBook Air because it's using the same chip as last year's iPhone. But if you judge it just on a nice experience, it does extremely well. And I suspect it will have an influence on other computers in that price range and raise the bar.
I can't go back to 8 gigs of RAM. I can't do it.
That worried me too. And you know, if you're editing video, it might be an issue. Most people are not doing ambitious video editing. They're using the web and writing stuff and maybe playing basic games. And the Neo is okay for all that. I used Photoshop on that and it was fine.
Well, that's a great place to end it for this segment. We'll be back with Harry for Keeping Tabs, but first a quick break, followed by Kristin's interview with Robert Reich and Heather Kinlaw Lofthouse of Inequality Media. Depending on how old you are and how you consume information, you might know Robert Reich from different platforms. You might have read one of his 18 books. You might know him from politics. He served on a number of presidential administrations, most notably as Secretary of Labor under President Bill Clinton. You might have taken one of his classes, and you might have seen him on YouTube dressed as a donut, explaining why you should register to vote. I personally know him best from being an occasional guest on his son's network Dropout. This is actually the second Reich we've had on this podcast, him and his son Sam as well. But the last stint, the YouTube donut costume explaining why you should register to vote, is a production of Inequality Media, a nonprofit organization co-founded by Robert Reich himself. Inequality Media makes videos explaining politics, power, wealth, and civic issues to Americans. The company's mission is to inform and engage the public about inequality and imbalance of power. For today's show, Kristin talked to Reich and Inequality Media's executive director, Heather Kinlaw Lofthouse. They talked about how Inequality Media came to be, how they approach creating videos for a broad range of audiences, and what hope they have for people in an age where the concentration of wealth and power is more out of balance than any time since the Gilded Age. Here's that conversation.
Robert, Heather, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Kristin.
Hear, hear.
I'm so excited to talk to both of you, and I think there's a lot for us to get into, particularly at this moment in time. To start, Robert, you've been ringing the alarm bell about inequality for more than 4 decades now in multiple ways, as a professor, a member of presidential administrations, through your books. We're really going to focus on Inequality Media, the nonprofit that you co-founded in 2015. So to start, just tell me about the original spark for that, and why was internet content, particularly like short form internet videos, the right fit for that kind of work?
Well, sometime around 2013 or 14, my son, Sam Reich, who I think you've had on your program,
Yes, he's been on the podcast.
Sam said to me very respectfully, I mean, he's a wonderful son. He said, Dad, I think you have written a lot of very good books and people like your books, but if you want to reach my generation, it's not through books, it's through social media. And I didn't fully understand even the meaning of the word social media, but he was very kind and he explained a lot to me. And it seemed like we needed to have some sort of social media, not he and I, but I and the other people that I started to gather needed to have a social media company to produce videos. And his point, and I think he's absolutely right, is that videos do something that the written word doesn't do. And this is particularly true of young people who are very acutely aware of what happens visually, and they pick up very, very subtle details in terms of visual media, but they are not, as my generation was, readers.
And Heather, you're the executive director at Inequality Media, and I know that you've known Robert for a long time. Tell me how you got involved.
I got involved because Bob, as I call him, Professor Reich, emailed me and said, hey, I'm doing a new thing. Do you want to talk about it? And so we talked about it, and he and a fellow named Jake Kornbluth had gotten together. They had made a feature-length documentary, and they said, okay, let's make videos. We've done it long form. We can do it short form. And so I came in and said, ooh, let's figure out internet video specifically, social video. What does it mean? What is this first 3 seconds people care about? And this is, as you said, in 2015. So we all came together. I wasn't executive director at the time. I was an interim for a minute. I served on the board. But we were at a point in time thinking, you know, we have got to be talking more about inequality. And we have Hillary and Bernie here. You know, it's really interesting, these two sides of the Democratic Party. And that's kind of where we were. So we were focused on inequality and democracy. But now we are focused on inequality and democracy. So to have this organization change over 11 years, we couldn't have predicted it. So we started with social video. We are social video first, but we've expanded into podcasts. We've expanded into feature films. We've expanded into doing some radio. And so we're trying to create more ripples and say the same thing in many ways. Nesting dolls approach, you know, put it in different formats, the same messages.
If I may just add to what Heather was saying, Kristin, and she's being very modest. I mean, Heather is the executive director. She envisioned this organization. She built the organization and deserves enormous credit.
Thank you for that, Bob.
Well, that's true.
You said something interesting there, too, about this and democracy part of that, which I want to touch on. Obviously, you talk about all types of inequality, economic inequality, racial inequality, but democracy is really core to this message, too. Why is that an important focus of this conversation, especially from the beginning?
Because one of the most really unfortunate aspects of the degree of inequality of income and wealth the United States is now suffering from is that it has found its way into American politics through everything from campaign contributions to public relations undertaken by very wealthy people to other ways in which really great wealth is translated into great political power. And so you can't separate wealth and power. I mean, arguably, wealth is not a zero-sum game. That it is certainly possible for some people to become extraordinarily wealthy without the necessity that other people become poor or don't have adequate resources. But power is a zero-sum game. That is, if few people have it, that means that other people don't. And this is really what the great jurist Louis Brandeis was getting at when he said, or reputed to have said in the late 1920s, America faces a choice. We can either have great wealth in the hands of a few people, or we can have a democracy, but we cannot have both.
It's interesting how relevant that is today, too, compared to when he said that. And Heather, you talked about, the format of Inequality Media has sort of adapted and changed in its 11 years. And I think the world has changed a little bit in that time, too, right? We're seeing these issues, particularly around wealth inequality, CEO pay, worker protections, democracy at large, only become even more relevant and concerning to everyday Americans. Have you both noticed that change affecting a response to your work, or is there a growing momentum around these topics?
I would say definitely, and I think we can use a few metrics to buttress that point. So one is, we're now up to 15 million followers across all our channels. We put out, for example, Professor Reich reacting to a clip from A Bug's Life, older film from a decade ago, and it was kind of going viral. Dan on our team said, let's just react to this. So in it, this grasshopper says we have to divide and conquer. And the ants are like, no, we don't. We're going to be fine. And so we put that out and we got 60 million views across the internet. And a lot of it skewed younger on Instagram, TikTok, also did well on Facebook. But so these topics we've been talking about, we keep bringing them up in different ways and they get bigger and more attention. And I would say, anecdotally, I watch my TV, I watch my phone, and you see politicians coming up today, young progressives and otherwise, we could talk about that, saying these talking points that we've been saying. The 1% is the problem. Corruption is the problem. And I've seen just these regular, obviously we have Bernie and AOC who've been saying this for a long time, and now we have Mamdani, but it's been these new faces coming up and random ads being served to me where you get to hear people saying what we've been saying. Not that only we were saying it, but I think it's a testament to the fact that people are waking up. This is not okay, and it's hurting average Americans more and more and more, and our democracy is at risk.
Robert, I want to give you a chance if there's anything you've noticed about this momentum growing or how people are responding to these sort of issues now when you talk about them.
Well, average Americans are catching on to the fact that the game, that is the market, the economy, has been rigged. The rules of the market. When I was much younger, the assumption was that there was a free market over here, and then over on the other side was government. And the question was how much government intruded or did not intrude on the free market. And that was a political question that dominated much of my youth and much of the politics of my youth. Well, many people are catching on to the reality that there is not a free market separate from government. Government creates and sustains and enforces and makes a free market. Without a government, you would not have a market. Now, what does that mean? If the wealthy have extraordinary power in determining what the rules of the market are going to be in terms of, say, monopoly or taxes or labor law or anything else, then the market is not neutral. The market is going to tip more and more in the direction of coming out with outcomes that favor the wealthy and hurt average working people. And that's exactly what's happening. Even in 2016, I noted I was doing, in fact, in 2015, I was doing research for a book at that time I was writing and doing the equivalent of kind of free-floating focus groups across the Midwest and much of the Farm Belt. And many people said to me when I asked, who are you thinking about for president? They said, well, there are two people we're very attracted by. One is Bernie Sanders, and the other is Donald Trump. And I remember at the time being amazed that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump would be in the same sentence. Mm-hmm. And I asked people why. And they said, well, because the game is rigged against us. And we want somebody who is outside politics, who understands this, and who will respond to the rigging against us, who will respond to the wealthy who have rigged the market. Now, this was 2015, and we're now 11 years later. That sentiment has become so central to American politics, both on the left and the right, Democrats and Republicans. The strongest force in American politics is anti-establishment anger at elites who have rigged the game. Now, the right and the left, Democrats, Republicans, have different approaches, and we could talk a lot about that. I don't think you're particularly interested for the purpose of this interview, but we at Inequality Media Civic Action, Inequality Media, I in my writings have very much tried to understand all of that and what it means and how to correct it.
That point about correcting is interesting to me because of who you're speaking to now through Inequality Media. Like previously in your political positions, you spoke to policymakers or people with some sort of political power. And then obviously as a professor, you spoke to students. But now you're really speaking to the internet, to the everyday Americans. Why is it worth talking to these people about these issues, especially when some people can feel, that they're a little bit powerless to change things?
Well, they are not powerless. The point is, that is where the power is or should be. The only way of breaking through elite domination of our politics and our economy is by empowering average people to become more politically active and to understand the relationship between politics and economics, to understand why they have a huge stake in changing the rules of the game in their own favor, in ways that enable them to have a fair shot at making it. We are not a news organization as such, but the news constantly, every day, is in front of people. That's what most people talk about. That's what most people understand to be America and the world. But the news that is in front of them is also symptomatic of deeper structural issues, changes in the political economy, changes in the rules of the game. Why is it, for example, that a president can essentially initiate a war on his own without Congress, without our allies, without enunciating to the American people why we are going to war, and then have such an extraordinary impact, negative impact, on oil prices, on what the cost of living is for actual people in the span of, we're now talking about 12 or 13 days. That needs to be explained to people because a lot of people are wondering about it. It's underneath the surface of the news, but it does require some explication. And that explication gives us an opportunity to explain to people the structure of both the economy and our political system and the ways in which they are inextricably wed together.
We often talk about framing, right? So something will come in from the news. I mentioned A Bug's Life. That wasn't the news. That was just something that was trending and had a good point.
Yeah.
So it's about seizing these opportunities and putting different frameworks on them. And again, seeing what resonates with people and then emphasizing that. And the statistics are staggering. I mean, we were talking about the numbers going up. So our followers are going up and engagements and those kind of metrics that any internet video or digital media company looks at. But I mean, 19% of federal campaign donations in 2024 were made by billionaires. That's one out of every $5. 300 new billionaires over 300 have been made, coined, whatever verb we use for billionaires in the past 8 years. I mean, there is such an we are in extremis around this ultra wealthy power. And the more ways we can say that and point that out, what's happening with fossil fuels and the environment and why did that, XYZ policy just happen? Let's follow the money. It might be because partially, there were donations made by fossil fuel companies and there was policy made as a result of that. And there are some lobbyists at play. Or this week we had the Ticketmaster. There was going to be a big anti-monopoly push and musicians were excited about it and fans were excited about it. We are being taken advantage of with fees and how we are charged and the experience we have in order to see artists play music. And they weren't held accountable. I mean, the Department of Justice just kind of, gave them, I don't even think a slap on the wrist is accurate. So I think everyone is seeing it, but we try to keep pointing it out in a way that draws the bigger picture, and we try and do it in a way that's compelling and engaging, and then we move on to the next thing, right? Like everyone else with their attention spans.
The other point here, and I want to build on what Heather just said, this is nonpartisan in the sense that we are not touting the Democrats. We are not pro-Republican, but we are pro-average working people. This is something that's very, very important because average working people are the ones who are bearing the costs of a system that is no longer in their hands. They are bearing the costs of political decisions that are helping enrich those who are already rich and are making it harder and harder for those who are not rich to get ahead. That's the story of America at this particular point in time. That's the underlying anger that we are dealing with in this country.
And it does seem very compelling. I mean, you mentioned engagement, and every time I see your posts, there's thousands of likes and all these comments. Have you been sort of surprised by that reaction or engagement, or is that heartening to see people like actually interacting with some of this content?
I'm certainly heartened by it. I'm amazed by it. I mean, I'm, again, of a generation that never saw these kinds of numbers, never saw this kind of responsiveness. I'm in the old kind of book and article world. I mean, it's been...
Oh, please. This...
No.
Really, Bob?
It's been an adjustment over the last 10, 15 years. But yes, when I used to write books, I mean, to get 10,000 or 15,000 people buying a book or responding to a book or responding to an article that I wrote would be just, would put me into heaven. I would just be amazed. Mm-hmm. But we're seeing numbers that are beyond anything that I had experienced before in my career.
Are there sort of any particular tactics for reaching new audiences who may not be aware of these issues or agree with your personal politics to still break through and educate them in this way?
It is a combination of a variety of experiments. And empirical experimentation is really at the heart of it because we try to be very agile. We are continuously trying new things. We understand that, and this is true of a for-profit as well as a non-for-profit organization, that success is and can be an enemy because success makes it harder to change. Success makes it easier for everybody inside an organization to say, well, we did it this way, let's just keep doing it this way. So what we are blessed with is a group of people who are not bound by success, who want to continuously find ways in which social media can be used in new, effective modes. And there are a lot of people that follow us, and I don't mean follow us in the sense of following, just tuning in. There are a lot of organizations, not-for-profits, there are a lot of social media groups that I've noticed use techniques that we develop because they're so effective. And that's great. We don't try to stop anybody from using these techniques. In fact, quite the opposite. We develop new techniques and we want the world to use them.
I notice you do a lot of sort of joint posts with other accounts, other nonprofits, other similar organizations as well, which seems like a great way to sort of bolster this, right? And continuously reach new people and new audiences.
That's it. We love a collab post on Instagram. And thanks to these companies who are making it easier for us to do that. But yeah, we work with a lot of different people. We have different experts come in. We lean on different organizations to surface data in interesting ways that we can use. But in terms of persuading people, so every platform is different, right? If you have a bunch of people following you, on average, they're probably going to skew in a certain direction because they follow you and they interpret your content in a certain way. But the good thing about the internet and the way we can play around with digital media is that you can test your content with people who don't follow you, right? And you can try and get it out in new ways. And so that's what we try to do. We try to say, oh, did that message hit with I don't know, self-proclaimed independents, and you can kind of see how the content does. And then you can try and get it out beyond your specific followers. So you're trying to get beyond the choir and all of those cliches. And we are able to do it, but it takes time and thought. And it's so fun to see some of the qualitative feedback when we do tests and they don't know who Professor Reich is. You know, they don't say, oh, he was with the Clinton administration, so therefore I have thoughts about him. They say things like, wow, that presenter was really compelling, or who's the actor? I really heard what he said about the minimum wage. And so it's fun to see. You got to be savvy about it. You can't just do one post and hope that, you know, a full range of America is processing it, because they're not for a lot of reasons. And so you have to be savvy about how to get content out to different groups of people.
We're talking a lot, obviously, about communication and messaging and educating people about this. I guess I'm curious if both of you think, like, can all of these issues of inequality be solved by messaging? Is it just a point of first making sure that people are aware and understand what's going on?
I think it is fundamentally a matter of explaining to people what they already observe and feel in terms of the political economy around themselves. I mean, people are very acutely aware, for example, of prices. They know exactly what's happening at the gas pump. Every time they fill up a gallon, you know, their gas tanks, they see precisely what's happening. They're very aware of their jobs. They're very aware of their incomes. They're aware of the cost of childcare, the cost of elder care. People are immersed in this world, but what they lack very often is an understanding of why. It's not just supply and demand. The economic rationales and understandings are important, but what's happening goes far beyond supply and demand. What's happening has to do with both the institutions of our society, everything from the Federal Reserve all the way through how state governments are operating and how income taxes versus sales taxes are working. But it goes fundamentally to questions of power. Who has the power? How do they exercise that power? How can they be made more accountable with regard to the power that they are exercising, both in the public sector and in the private sector?
I would just add that our mission is to educate and engage. So we don't write public policy. You know, we're not writing the latest wealth tax that someone's doing. That's not our role. Our role, and we've owned it from the beginning, is educating and engaging. And then people can feel empowered to request different things of their elected officials. They can go out and sign petitions. They can run for office themselves. They can be the leaders that we need and that many of them actually want to be. So much needs to be done to lessen inequality and the gaps here. And so much of it is systemic and policy related. But when I think messaging is key, and that's our role.
In the background of everything we're doing is our understanding that the political economy, and it's politics and economics, it's a political economy moving through time, changing through time. And every week it changes, something else is changing. And those changes are affecting average working people, average Americans in very profound ways, but they don't know it. They need to understand it. They want to understand it. There's a hunger out there for understanding all of this in very real terms, not in theoretical terms, not in terms of abstract models, but in terms of actually what is happening and why is it happening this way.
Last summer, you released this documentary about Robert's last semester of teaching called The Last Class. And in that documentary, Robert, you say a true leader helps people overcome cynicism. And both of you have mentioned, you know, that a goal of that was to show how education can triumph over cynicism. I think that's really interesting when these issues that you're talking about can make people a little bit cynical about the state of the world. So I guess, like, how do you sort of veer away towards cynicism and towards hope? And do you have hope about all this?
Well, I certainly have hope, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I were not hopeful. But I think there's a difference between skepticism, which is appropriate. I think people do need to be skeptical when they hear the news, when they view social media, when they're engaged with all of the ways in which facts and news and lies travel at an accelerating speed. But there's a difference between skepticism and cynicism. I think it is very important for all of us to understand that hopelessness is a dead end. That's the end of the road. We can't reform our system. We can't change our democracy. We can't make the economy work for most of us. We can't create a society that is a society that most of us value and most of us would like to be a member of if we lose hope, if we become so cynical that we basically say to ourselves, it's not worth even trying. And that's something I think that is in the background of what we're trying to do. We're trying to give people levers, ideas, not only empower them through understanding what's actually happening, but also empower them through a sense of what they can do as ordinary Americans.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about, and I think I had lots more questions, but I love ending on that. Thank you both so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Kristin.
Well, thank you, Kristin.
Okay, we're back with Harry, and it's time to wrap up the show with Keeping Tabs. This is where each one of us shares a story, trend, or a piece of pop culture we're following right now. Harry, since you're our guest, what are you keeping tabs on?
I've been paying attention to a trend which is more and more visible and has been written about a number of times, including by Ezra Klein in the New York Times recently. And that is this growing digital divide between people who oftentimes work in the tech industry, maybe in the San Francisco area, and are all in on AI and kind of rearranging their life to be very AI-centric. And in some cases, either paying a lot of money for AI or working at companies that pay for their AI, and the rest of the world, which is made up of people who are not that serious about AI, and in fact, in some cases are very skeptical about AI and are not only not using it a lot, but are bending over backwards not to use it. And in some ways, this reminds me a little bit of the digital divide that existed in the 1990s when not everybody was on the internet, and there were some people who were using it a lot, and it was changing their lives. And there were, in the early days, an equal number of people who weren't using the internet, and in some cases either because they just didn't have access or couldn't afford it. And people talked a lot about the fact that the internet users might have a leg up on everybody else. And this new trend with AI is a little bit different because in some cases people have very negative feelings about AI in a way that I don't recall people having negative feelings about the internet, but I do see some parallels.
Yeah, the negative feelings and the reactions, I think, is the one different point. Because in terms of the adoption, I think you're absolutely right. It feels very much like the internet, or even like what we were talking about with personal computer use back in the day. But people are very angry and frightened by AI. And I think it basically just comes back to the fact that messaging has been like, well, it could wipe out the entire economy and steal your job. So I get that to an extent.
And also, a lot of what we see from AI these days is AI slop. And it's maybe not having such a great impact on things like social networks so far. So there are lots of reasons to be skeptical about AI.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say it's something interesting, too, in the different ways people are using it. I'm blanking on the specifics of this piece I read, but it was basically like, if you are sort of aware of the limits of AI and using it in these ways where you're still sort of in control of your cognitive process and like just using it as a tool, that sets you up better than if you were totally outsourcing all your thinking to AI and sort of just like relying on it in these ways where it replaces everything for you. And so like there's also that divide in sort of use cases for AI and like in understanding how it can fit into your life and how you would adapt to it.
Well, so much about it is just, exactly. What would you use it for? So I think some of the divide with like the Silicon Valley folks, like if you work in the tech industry, you probably have just a little bit more of a literacy with tech in general, but also some of the things that AI has gotten really good at is coding, is stuff that would be broadly applicable to tech workers. I admit, like, I do use like AI and where I do it, I think it's helpful for like summarizing things or helping with some research like Kristin was talking about, but I don't know how I would build my entire life around AI at this point, given what I do. Speaking of Gen AI in particular, because I used a ton of machine learning stuff in terms of automations in editing and in processes like making this podcast right now. So maybe I'm lying. Maybe my life is built around AI. But then other people, it's like two conversations, because if your main view of AI is, okay, I'm using a chatbot the way I would a search engine and AI slop videos online. I know a lot of people in the arts and a lot of people in, video production, in TV, film, stuff like that, who are like, this is not good for our industry. I don't like this. This is threatening our jobs, and it's not good. And I think they're kind of right, because like the AI video slop is not good. It's not anywhere near as good as what AI is actually good at. So it's like two different conversations, because this is such a sprawling technology with different use cases that aren't growing and building at the same rate in every sector.
Yeah. I found that piece, which is on Fast Company, called AI is creating the first generation of cognitively outsourced humans. And so the line that stuck out to me was basically like, the future is not going to belong to the people who use AI the most. It'll belong to those who know when not to use it. So I think it is like applying to what specific circumstances are you using AI for?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. And I think probably some of the most effective users of AI will use it rather sparingly, but in ways that are actually effective and beneficial.
Well, that makes me feel better. Kristin, what are you keeping tabs on?
Oh, gosh. So I just saw these new Kalshi ads in D.C. Did you see these?
I have not seen these, no.
They list out Kalshi rules. Rule number 1 is we ban insider trading.
Well, okay, you don't ban it. It's against the law,
Right.
Kalshi.
Number 2 is we don't do death markets. Rule number 3 is we aren't the House. And rule number 4, which I love that it's all the way at rule number 4, is we operate under U.S. law.
Wow,
And
okay.
There's already great reactions to this online, which is very, along the lines of, oh, my ad saying I follow the law is raising a lot of questions.
It seems like something you shouldn't have to call out.
Exactly, yeah.
Like if I showed up to a restaurant tomorrow and the waiter came over and was just like, let me, before I read you the specials today, I just want to let you know that we are in compliance with the health department.
Yeah, wouldn't you question that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm like, why did you need to call that out at the table?
It's just so interesting to see this marketing approach from Kalshi, because it feels like what an SNL skit of a marketing approach for Kalshi would come up with. And I can't wait to see what's next.
Oh my God.
I feel like a pretty substantial percentage of the people in the world have never heard of Kalshi yet, if they're not into this stuff. And this might be the first time they're exposed to this brand. And it does not seem like a terribly welcoming way to learn what Kalshi is.
Can you imagine if the first thing you ever saw about Kalshi was we don't do death markets? Like, what?
Oh my God. Oh, that'd be rough. Well, I'm sure Jeff Beer is going to have a lot on that on fastcompany.com and in the next episode of Brand New World, which is coming out in another week. So stay tuned for that. My keeping tabs is going to be like a hard left turn into something super silly. So my TikTok algorithm has decided to serve me this guy who's basically started a series of vlogging for the past month that starts off, hi, I'm Steve. I'm getting into community theater and I have no idea what I'm doing. And he's chronicling his journey from starting to prepare for an audition for community theater to his audition, which was this past Saturday. I don't know what musical it's for, but I've been following this and it's just very sweet and earnest in this guy. And it's not like he's blowing up online. Like videos have, I think, like at most like 20,000, 30,000 views. But it's been served to me because, of course, I'm a theater adult. And this has been served to me. And I am way too emotionally invested in whether Steve gets cast in this musical.
Oh, yeah.
But I do have a good update. Steve got a callback.
Oh, exciting.
He got a callback.
Better than reality TV.
Yeah, better than reality TV. So, Steve, if you're a fan of the Most Innovative Companies podcast, I'm rooting for you. Rooting for you, buddy.
There's a lot to say and that has been said about this sort of dichotomy of like going on the internet to talk about getting off the internet, right? Like there's this trend of like, oh, use these bags that are these analog bags or whatever. And some of that feels performative in a way. But I love these things where you're actually following someone like do something in real life. Like, yeah, and then come to talk about it on the internet. You're like, oh, this is his little side quest thing he's doing for real. And I think that in a way that's more inspiring instead of, people who film themselves staring at the wall for an hour to get off their screens. It's like, well, this is someone who's doing something else with his time.
Yeah, exactly. You're kind of like, take a more of a lesson through of Schrodinger's cat. Like, you don't have to be observed all the time. But I think the thing that like strikes me and what like strikes a chord with people like Steve is just like the earnestness, that they're just earnestly approaching something that they're not necessarily good at or have an expertise in, which is plenty of that online. I mean, I love watching people who are like experts at what they do, doing interesting things online. But there's something refreshing about just that feels very like old internet, like Web 1.0 internet, of people just earnestly doing things.
And trying something.
Yeah. Now, that being said, I have a very limited window into this guy's life, and maybe the cynical thing in me is like, oh, I hope this isn't a Ken Bone situation. But yeah.
There are all these examples of algorithms favoring stuff that makes people angry.
Yeah.
And also algorithms favoring stuff created by people to get attention. And earnestness is kind of in short supply on the internet, and any example of that being out there and interesting to people feels good.
Yeah, it does.
It's really nice. And I think the fact that it's also like, it's not a huge viral hit. Like, this isn't, it's just a guy that's like, it's literally just like the New York theater, like, community has been getting served this, I think. And it's just a few thousand people following this regularly. And I'm just like, oh, go Steve. I think that's a good place to leave it. Harry, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, folks. It was a lot of fun.
That's it for Most Innovative Companies. Our show is produced by Blake Odom, Sam Gebauer, Hawa Atori, and Mariam Kiparuitse. Editing by Matt Toder, mix and sound design by Tad Wadhams and Nicholas Torres, and our executive producer is me. Remember again to subscribe, rate, and review, and we will see you next week.